Hi, welcome to the IMMA Summer School. Unfortunately this year again we're in the midst of a pandemic and we all can't gather here of course in IMMA and in the Royal Hospital Containment. So I thought it might be a nice idea to make this video which will also accompany a talk on mapping the site of Containment to give you a sense of what the place is like and what its heritage and history is like, all under the idea of containment perhaps in some loose form. So I'm here in the courtyard of the Royal Hospital Containment. It's quite an extraordinary development in the history of Dublin's architecture. It was the first classical building constructed and would have been like something landing from outer space in what was essentially a very medieval city. And from that time that it was built in 1680, it opened in 1684 as a retirement home for invalided and old soldiers, and it actually served that purpose right up until Ireland became a free state in 1922, its last residents only leaving in 1929. So it had quite a long life. It served for a short period of time as a police headquarters up to 1957, but it was largely abandoned, and then opened after restoration in the 1980s as a centre for culture and art, becoming IMMA in 1991. And so IMMA itself has been here in the building for nearly 30 years, so I suppose prolonging and elongating its history, and we're very happy to be in this beautiful building. But it really kind of marks a root change in the history of the city. This building was the first of what you might call a heterotopian revamp of the city as it transformed from a medieval one into a Georgian city. And so this was the first large institution that was kind of developed to handle and control and contain something that was becoming a social nuisance. So as the standing armies of the King of England began to become aged, there was a situation where a lot of men were being discharged from duty, and they were pugilistic men of course and used to fighting, some post-traumatic stress syndrome sufferers also, and they were generally becoming a nuisance. So the development of these retirement institutions, this one here in Dublin and also the Royal Hospital in Chelsea, was really a way of trying to contain the trouble that may be caused by releasing these men into the general population. They also served a purpose by being here as staying in a kind of a military way of life, and would have been used as militias to maintain the peace of the city before the invention of the police force much later in the 19th century. River run past even Adams, by swerve of shore and bend of bay, brings us by a commodious ficus of recirculation back to Howth Castle and Environs. This is the opening line to Joyce's Finnegan's Wake and the closing line to his postmodern labyrinthine book. And it's really interesting that he starts off his story really about Dublin with the river itself. And we're here standing over the River Liffey. The name of the river comes from the plains of Kildare that it flows through, Máel Lifa. But it used to have an ancient name called An Ruartach, which is also interesting because it means the sprinter or hurdler, because the river, of course, it has a very short course when it comes down from the Wicklow Mountains through the plains just to our west and turns around and comes back to the east. And so it's prone very much to flooding. And over the course of the centuries, many of the bridges that have been built over the river have been washed away by these, I suppose, tumultuous events. Also, the city, as it grew out of a medieval city into a much larger modern city in the 18th century, had a bit of a problem with sanitation, and it wasn't until the 19th century that they developed a comprehensive sewage system, because just a little bit further downstream you had what were called euphemistically the Summer Isles, one of them being Usher's Island, and in behind Usher's Island was the city privy pits, which when the river flooded was prone to, of course, leaving human excrement all over the place. So you can imagine that the city wasn't a very healthy place in terms of pandemic and disease, and it's had a long history of various outbreaks of typhoid and typhus and cholera. So it's been a kind of a constant battle really with containing disease in the city. What's also kind of interesting about the river, of course, is we're talking about the site of Kilmainham, which is down at this end of the city, and it gets a little bit neglected because of the medieval city that developed behind us, but originally, of course, developed by early Irish settlers at the ford of the river, where one of the great highways of the ancient Irish used to kind of come up from the south and cross the river on its way north And because it's a tidal estuary of brackish water, you would have had people, of course, having to wait for the tide to subside to cross the river. And so a settlement grew up on the higher southern bank of the river, eventually became Christianized, and around the same time as St. Mainan set up his monastery that gave Kilmainham its name, where IMMA exists and resides today. And so Kilmainham is really as important really as the forge down in what became the centre of Dublin at a later stage. And then, of course, the monks had a great time really until the late 700s, 800s, when the Vikings began to, I suppose, migrate out of Scandinavia and Norway and Denmark and come down and raid all the monasteries for some easy pickings, for slaves and for, I suppose, wealth and gold and food resources. And so the whole city was transformed as the Norse began to settle. And then we have the development of Viking Dublin. And Viking Dublin, which really was based down here in the city centre, also was just as important here, because where we are, right here at Euston Station, we also have massive Viking graveyards discovered when they built the railway in the 1840s. So this area was just as important to Viking Dublin as the city further to the east behind us, the city centre. Interestingly also at this point, we might as well talk about the demise of Viking, the Hiberno Viking Dublin, when Brian Boru, who was an Irish chieftain and king, came to Dublin. Interestingly, where the site of the Royal Hospital is and IMMA today, it's a promontory between two rivers, the Camac on its south side and the Liffey on its north side. And it's a big high piece of ground that at the time of 1013 and 1014, when Brian Boru came and camped here to attack the Viking city of Dublin, it's an amazing position to look out, a strategic position to look out across the city and observe your enemies. And it was from there that he marched north to face the Vikings at the Battle of Clontarf in 1014, which really kind of marks the end of Viking Dublin and the beginning, just shortly after that, of the medieval period of the city. Here we are down at Bow Bridge, which is the bridge connecting, this was the city side to the Kilmainham side, over the Camac River, which is the other river of importance. When we talk about the Royal Hospital, Kilmainham is a strategic military raised gravel bank in between these two rivers of the Liffey and the Camac. Of course, and it's these water courses that really make this an excellent position for settlement as well, because the Camac was a river that runs through Kilmainham and supplies energy and power for an awful lot of the mills that existed down along the valley where the village was situated. It's also right on the borderline between the actual city boundary and the country boundary, the county boundary, here at Cromwell's quarters, which is a euphemistic name for a street that used to be called Murder Lane, and it continued on up the hill as Cutthroat Lane. So perhaps getting its name just because this side of the line might be a bit more lawless than the city side. Here we're just out about 300 metres outside what is now the gateway into IMMA and the Royal Hospital. And what we can see behind me, in fact, is the infirmary. So this building was the infirmary to the Royal Hospital. So when they built that retirement home for the soldiers in the Royal Hospital Kilmainham, they observed, of course, in very much Enlightenment medical principles, that they would have a separate infirmary and separating, of course, the sick from the healthy, which is something that we understand now in terms of pandemics and contagion. It's really, really important to keep the sick away from the healthy. So this series of buildings down here behind me are all part of that infirmary. In some cases there's notes in the Board of Governors minutes from their meetings about ordering chains and cages even for the insane. So again, containing those who would have been suffering from, I suppose, mental trauma from various types of battles and wars. So it was kind of an essential element. And so we're in this kind of arc at this side of the city between this infirmary institution, the Royal Hospital, which is just up behind us a little bit. We have St. Patrick's Hospital, which is also back up here on the hill, which was a bedlam and a mental hospital built, of course, in the 1740s. Not too far away, of course, as well, just a little bit further up behind that, we have the first industrial workhouse, so again for accommodating the poor of the city. All these developments taking place in the 1700s. So this big kind of development of institutions, these heterotopias about solving all these kind of social issues and problems become part of this modernisation of Dublin as we emerge from that medieval city that existed before it. And again, the infirmary here and the Royal Hospital being the very beginnings of all of that. Here in the cemeteries at the west end of the grounds of the Royal Hospital, we have the one piece of evidence that links us back to the early monastic site that was established here sometime around 606 AD by Saint Mainan, who would have been a noble lord of a house from the Midlands who set up a monastery here. He had 27 monks who followed him around, according to the annals of the Grand Masters, the Four Masters. And we have what's left of that monastery. The only piece of kind of evidence that connects us back to it is this cross shaft, which is a boundary marker for that monastery and has been standing here for most of the time. It's been knocked down twice in its history and resurrected again. One of the masters of the hospital in the 1700s, the mid-1700s, he levelled the cemetery in an attempt to contain, I suppose, the grounds of the Royal Hospital to stop the public burials that used to take place here. And he levelled the cemetery, buried all the headstones and walled off the grounds. But of course this created a bit of a social problem, and the hospital was attacked by an angry mob, and eventually the law courts made a decision where the grounds had to be reopened again for burials. Down at the end of the hill there's also what was a holy well. It's now no longer in existence. It was destroyed when the railway line was built here in the 1840s. But the holy well would have connected back perhaps even to pagan ritual and would have been used and treated as a holy well, of course, at the time of St. Mainan and onwards. The cemetery here closed in 1833 permanently after the cholera epidemic that saw thousands of burials in the space of a week here, and the graveyards became so overcrowded that it was decided to close the cemeteries permanently, and that's around the time that they opened a new cemetery up in Glasnevin to become the city cemetery. We're really lucky here in the Royal Hospital and the grounds of IMMA to have all of this open green space. The Royal Hospital was established in grounds that were part of the Phoenix Park, the walled deer park of the King, so it came with quite a substantial amount of land. I think in the original charter there was 65 acres. It's now just around 49 acres or so of grounds. It was largely almost divided in half by the development of the railway line. But what's very significant about the meadow here, right beside the Royal Hospital, is the absence of something. So after the Norman conquest in the 1170s, a medieval priory was established here for the Knights Hospitallers. And they were absolutely essential in the management of Ireland for military reasons and political reasons for the King of England. And it's extraordinary that this huge military defensive complex is completely gone. There's no trace of it whatsoever. In the 1540s, when the monasteries were dissolved and the lands were all secularized, the monastery fell into disrepair, used very briefly for a while as a viceregal lodge before that function was taken up at Dublin Castle. And so after that time of really in the early 1600s, the building started to fall into disrepair and was fully quarried out for the development of other things, even the walls of the Phoenix Park, and some of it even for the Royal Hospital Containment as well. So there's nothing left of it at all. Behind me here we have the ceremonial entrance to the Royal Hospital, which is down at the west end of the grounds. It's the Richmond Tower. It's built by Francis Johnston, but originally it didn't stand there. It was down at the end of Watling Street, which is much further towards the east of the grounds, and marked the entrance to what was called Galway's Walk, a nice promenade that came in along the River Liffey into the grounds. But when they built the railway line in the 1840s, the tower was causing an obstruction to traffic, and so as part of the agreement for the lands to be given to the railway company, they agreed to dismantle the tower and move it entirely up here onto this location. And of course, when they moved it, underneath some rendered wood that was made to look like stone, they found the coat of arms of Francis Johnston, who had hoped that in the future, when rack and ruin came upon this building, his coat of arms would stand proudly over the hospital entrance. But unfortunately, they were discovered and destroyed, so there's no record of them here at all. So to conclude our journey through the grounds of the Royal Hospital and Kilmainham, and to give you an idea of the site and the location, we've come here to the Baroque Chapel, which is one of the best preserved Baroque interiors in the country, to sign off. And I hope we've given you a really good sense of how Kilmainham has developed and this whole site through that, monastic and medieval, Viking, and modern Dublin, and the development of modern Dublin as well, and how essential this location and site was, even for one of our last rebellions, which was the 1916 Rising. This building and location was really the headquarters for the British Army to retake the city from the insurgents. So really containing the Irish politically has been very central to this location for quite a considerable amount of time. And having IMMA here is also kind of a touchstone to containment when we consider that the modern art gallery as a trope, certainly during the Cold War, was a way of promoting individuality and creativity sort of in the face of communism and collectivization. So the theme of containment kind of continues in many ways through the most recent history of the museum. So I hope you've enjoyed this short video.